I'm Britt Udison, Executive and Artistic Director at the Loft Literary Center. Welcome to this live stream at Virtual Wordplay. I'm so glad you're here with us. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about what brought us here today. For the last year, the Loft staff has been working hard to put together an outdoor book festival that would have gathered 100 authors with 10,000 visitors in our neighborhood in downtown Minneapolis. As COVID-19 hit, we knew we had to think about everything we do differently, especially this festival. While we were disappointed that we wouldn't be able to gather in person, we became even more committed to supporting writers, celebrating new books, and finding new ways to assert the connective power of the written word. In a time of anxiety, we want to offer a powerful event for readers, writers, and booksellers. When we first approached our sponsors, their first question was, what is a virtual festival? And to be honest, we didn't know. Our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, agreed to make a leap of faith with the Loft. With courage, generosity, and vision, they have worked alongside us to figure out what this virtual festival might become. We are grateful to our sponsors and donors. Their generosity is incredible, but it is not enough. We believe it is essential, especially during a health and financial crisis, to offer programs that are free and accessible to all. But that has led to a significant revenue loss. A live event would have included ticket revenue, beer sales, exhibitor fees, and additional sponsorships. The Loft is not closed. We continue to offer classes, fellowships, conversations, support for readers and writers in addition to this festival. We are here to support the literary community, and we ask that you continue to support us. If you are able, please consider making a contribution to the Loft today. Thank you for being here.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Loft Wordplays, How to Be, a conversation with John Freeman and Casey Schwartz. My name is Abby Frank Taylor and I work at the Loft Literary Center. Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to thank Wordplay's presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, for continuing to support this festival in its virtual form. This conversation is part of St. Catherine's Critical Conversation series, so sending extra gratitude to them today. While all Loft Wordplay events are free, if you'd like to support the Loft programming, you can do so by clicking the support button below. Also using that button, you can buy Casey's book, Attention, a Love Story, and John's two books that will be discussed today, The Dictionary of Undoing and The Park, from the Loft's Wordplay Bookshop. This is an awesome way to get yourself some amazing books to keep you company in this time, but also to support indie bookstores, the Loft, and of course, the work of our Wordplay authors. We'll also be releasing next week's Wordplay programming later this afternoon, so be sure to check out loftwordplay.org to see what's coming next. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to John and Casey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you, Abby. It's so nice to be here in my own house. How was your joyless cave of concentration? This is a phrase from Attention, a Love Story, which jumped out at me, which I think everyone can relate to, Casey.
John, I'm in sort of 4-month-old baby mode in my particular quarantine of concentration right now. No, I mean, we had a chance to talk a little bit yesterday about our own respective relationships with the joyless cave of concentration. How's yours going over in Manhattan in this moment?
That's pretty good. I have this sort of ice cream cakey picture of a typewriter behind me, which, as I was reading Attention, a Love Story, I was thinking about this because, I'm writing on this device that I'm talking to you through right now, and it can interrupt me and has many different ways to interrupt me at all times. But, you grew up the child of two writers, one, a journalist, not unlike yourself, who probably was on a typewriter, this machine that could not interrupt her if it even wanted to. And so my joyless cave of concentration has always been, I've always been fighting with the very things that you talk about, which is like how to manage consciousness.
Right. No, in fact, yes, I remember both my mother and my father's typewriters very vividly from childhood. And then the arrival of the laptop when I was in I think it was 6th or 7th grade, this sort of glitchy laptop arrived in our house. And there was a typing program on it called Mavis Beacon. where I first learned how to like touch type. It was sort of like a video game. But I think, you know, growing up that way, and I think you did too, sort of is to learn, you know, when your parents are in this line of work where they're sort of, their whole pursuit is based on focus and mastery of understanding in some way. You know, you do learn this model of attention that becomes kind of a lifelong pursuit, or something that you're never quite living up to, or it becomes sort of fraught with meaning or loaded with meaning. And that was, I think that's been my relationship to attention, and part of the psychological backdrop for getting into this subject in this book.
Your book's kind of like a quest story. You know, you follow a path that takes you to psychological experts, to psychedelic people, to doing ayahuasca in Central America. You have your own kind of journey of coming off Adderall. Where does it actually begin? Was it when you made the crossover in college, when you realized, oh, if I take the blue pill, I can concentrate for 20 hours? Is that the beginning of this kind of long journey for you?
Yeah, I think that in a sense, yes. I mean, I didn't know at 18 that I had obviously some terrible insecurity, but of course we all do, about paying attention. And could I pay attention well enough? And this was, you know, the year 2000, and Adderall had been on the market maybe 4 years at that point. It was unfamiliar to me. And a friend handed it to me one night in our freshman year of college. And she said she didn't want it because it would make her do cartwheels down the hall all night. And for her, that was a bad thing. But for me, that was like the ultimate advertisement. And I wound up just falling down this rabbit hole of kind of enchantment with these amphetamines, because they gave me unfettered focus, boundless energy, and they made anything that you sort of were applying your mind to inherently pleasurable for a time.
Yeah.
And that I started off the book in this kind of false love story with Adderall, because it took me over 10 years to kick that drug out of my life, realizing that it was actually creating this joyless cave of concentration and leading me in some way farther from true attention. But John, tell me about your caveless cave of concentration. I wanted to kind of press you on it yesterday when we spoke too briefly, but you said that this was also kind of your college years was spent in this kind of cave.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I went to an academically rigorous college, which sort of measured your worth in sweat. Although Swarthmore, where I went, was even sweatier. And
right.
You know, I went to a public high school in California, and my career plans until I was 14 involved playing NBA basketball. So I was academically way behind, you know, the curve, so to speak. So when I got to Swarthmore, I got my ass kicked in exams, and I suddenly had to learn a whole new kind of ability to sit still. And so that scene where you describe taking Adderall the first time is very like the way that I would study, except Adderall didn't exist. And so I just had to sit there with, like, you know, Coke and Splenda, or coffee all night.
Sweet and low, actually.
But, you know, your descriptions, I love that your book goes into metaphysical questions about attention, because in that moment when I got very, very serious about reading and writing and studying, I did experience a kind of coherence that was so new to me and so rewarding, it felt almost religious.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to reattain that the rest of my life. And it's probably in some ways what's made me become a writer the way that I am. And I love that as you go along through your book, you start studying people, some of whom are living, like James William, and then some of whom are dead, like William James, and studying their definition of what attention is. Because I feel like we've all experienced, even if we're not studious people, what undivided attention, both presented to us and undivided attention coming out of us feels like. And it can be religious, it can be professionally deep rewarding, and it can also be like love. And so
Right.
I'm curious who, as you cycle through these various gurus, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
who you felt closest to in their definition of attention.
Well, I mean, any time you write about attention, I feel like inevitably you have to invoke William James.
Yeah.
And and he was a fabulous writer, and he made attention poetic at the end of the 19th century. He sort of it had never been seen as this subject that was worthy of its own kind of serious study until that era. And he wrote about it as a novelist might, in such beautiful, exalted terms. And he felt, attention is how we define the meaning in our life. It's how we shape our days. So he lifted it to these wonderful heights. And then what's funny is in the 20th century, it kind of, attention as a subject sort of faded from view after having this period of having been studied by many scientists and philosophers. Then it came back again in the 1970s and 80s. And here we are still trying to understand what is at its core. And I think there's still a mystery around that, which I loved when I was reporting. And I would talk to neuroscientists who would readily say, we still don't have clarity or a way of kind of simply defining what we mean when we say attention. But I mean, I don't know. I think of all the people I wrote about in my book, the one that I felt closest to in terms of how he thought about attention and in terms of how it obsessed him was David Foster Wallace, who I think by the end of his life kind of saw it as one of the seminal issues in kind of like how to live well. And in The Pale King, it crops up. I mean, John, you know this, 150 times. And he,
Yes.
and of course, it had first appeared in his commencement speech explicitly when he talks about, going through your life and trying to imagine your way outside of yourself, like trying to look at someone and attend to them and think, wait, they are not who they might seem. They are not to be necessarily dismissed or disparaged. And you can, by paying close attention, you actually can find your way to love and compassion. And so that kind of ethical treatment of attention so pulled me in.
Yeah, he was obsessed with that, with language's ability to, and its failure to make us leave our own bodies and go into the minds and bodies of another person. He seemed agonized by that, just as a writer, as an individual. And while you were speaking about William James, one of the passages of that section of your book I like very much is where you describe him writing with Henri Bergson. And Bergson's like 17 years younger, and they're sort of trading stories, and they become friends by mail. And a lot of your book and some of what I've written about in the past have to do with the speeding up of the aperture of our attention window, and what that does to us morally, psychologically, physically. And one of the questions I had was, what do you think it does for our understanding of friendship? That when our idea of what attention is likes and clicks versus sort of slow, eddying, static, almost elegiac time, if you will, versus the kind of speeded up Instagram time that we live in. And one reason I asked this too is that Wallace, I don't have this experience with him. I only met him a few times, but he was apparently a very great letter writer too.
Right. I read that. And John, actually, you wrote such a touching piece about you interviewing Wallace, but then he sort of turns the table around on you. Yeah. And that was the end of his life.
He just published Consider the Lobster. And we went and had an interview. And, before the interview started, he had asked me about 20 questions. I was sort of, it was
unusual. It's
sorry?
So unusual. It's so unusual, isn't it?
It's very weird. Yeah. It's also just deeply normal. I think he was trying very hard to be normal. And I think one of the things that your book documents, which I think we all go through, but because we're all very adaptive, we're trying to normalize, is how does it get normal to live in the technology world that we live in? Wallace was trying to constantly step back and say, like, is this normal? Is it normal that we're entertaining ourselves to death? That, like, we'll basically sit there with a diaper and watch TV, if almost, And I feel like one of the things that you keep looking for is someone to tell you, like, is this environment of attention normal? And I was quite shocked in the section of your book where you're talking to, or maybe you're repeating a story that a developer, technology developer, I think it's your friend who's getting a PhD at Stanford, says, which is that a lot of technology developers put their phones on airplane mode because they don't want to be interrupted as many times as we can be interrupted.
Right. This friend was such a sort of extreme example, and I have no idea if this is true for his colleagues and his cohort, but this was 2017, he had so successfully isolated himself from his phone and what information he chose to be exposed to, that he did not know what the Me Too movement was. Totally unfamiliar with it, barely could identify Harvey Weinstein. It was like he was operating in this ingenious zone of, sort of computer programming, sort of rarefied attention. And he had just perfected his way. And he said, well, that's because anyone on my level knows that your IQ plummets as soon as your phone is on and accepting a cascade of information.
Right.
So I was so struck by him, but I don't know how true that is of others.
What was your experience of psychedelics like? Because I've always touched, all the brain altering things with a long sort of poker, because I don't know. I feel I had, like you, I'm a little older than you, but I went to high school and they told us stories in health and science class where there was that guy who thought he was a glass of orange juice the rest of his life after he took LSD just once. And I thought, all right, no, I'm going to stay with the LSD less route so I can be orange juicy for the rest of my life. But did you have any trepidation about taking the ayahuasca or,
No, well, in the end, I couldn't really take a proper dose of it because I was on these antidepressants and you're not supposed to mix. So I was there kind of like taking this homeopathic dose and I was drawn to this domain. I mean, it was in my instinct, it was relevant to attention because it seems like this world of psychedelic science is cropping up at a moment where we're so saturated by tech. And it's like this craving to find another way to be, another way to live, that I think is driving a lot of people towards these substances. But I was at this ayahuasca retreat as a reporter and an outsider. Even though I was very envious by the time I was actually there and unable to participate. Even though going in, I thought, I don't want to participate. Because it was so fascinating to see these over the course of a week, the arc of change in the people who were around me. Have you ever found yourself in one of those settings?
No, not at all. I had a student who wrote a novel set in the very same ayahuasca retreat, I think, that you went to. And I once interviewed Paul Theroux for this novel called Blindness, which was an erotic novel that begins with an ayahuasca retreat. But no, I even though I write poetry, I had a phase where I thought, oh, I want to live a bohemian life. The forms of consciousness expansion that come with that have always made me very nervous, just to be honest. And I think it's not that I judge it. It's just I know it's kind of not for me, and I don't think it's through lack of control. It's I want to be using prosthetics that I can depend upon to engage in reality. And part of the book that I have out, Dictionary of Then Doing, is it's looking at the prosthetic of language. And to sort of describe reality and how it's been sort of mangled and deformed by forms of culture that are being driven by speed.
Mm.
And so it overlaps with your book in the sense that, you know, you're looking at what it feels like to be in this world where our attention is shattered and fragmented
Mm.
by, you know, pharmaceuticals and technology. And Dictionary of the Undoing, I'm trying to kind of say, like, well, how do we put things back together into a coherent thing? Well,
Right.
it's language to some degree. And well, what words would we do to what words would we rely upon to do that? And by looking at the words, I realized I had to sort of slow down and kind of touch them slowly and,
Right.
and mindfully. And that was the way to sort of rebuild a coherent reality for me.
John, reading your dictionary in this particular moment is so powerful. And I'm so happy to have a chance to talk to you about it because, you know, as I read it, I thought, how did you choose these 26 words? Did they come? I mean, there's one for each word of the alphabet, but was it obvious to you which to choose? What was your process?
It was very associative, probably to some degree, like researching a book. Like one thing leads you to another, leads you to another. Today, while I was preparing to talk to you, I was determined to figure out where Simone Weil said that, you know, attention. What is the great quote that she has about attention and love?
Attention is it the rarest and most rare and pure form of generosity?
Yes. Which is, I mean,
that's such a powerful line.
Yeah, I think of that when I think about my mother and father and everyone I have had the privilege of being loved by. And with words, I didn't sort of pick these out as my favorite. I began with apathy because I was just feeling like information, which was becoming a kind of lifeboat for me in the dissociative and frankly chaotic Trump era, was actually making me feel apathetic because the more information I acquired about what had happened that day, the more I felt I had nothing I could actually do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began with apathy, and then I realized, no, actually apathy is not where I want to begin thinking. I want to begin with agitate, because mostly what our time feels like is agitating. And agitating things begin in the body. They grab you and vibrate you, or rattle, metaphorically, your mind. And I feel like what's happening right now is we're watching certain citizens, you know, shook out of the tree of what a citizen can count to be. You know, it's like, okay, if you weren't born here, if you migrated here, if you came here in chain migration, you know, currently now no one's allowed in. And I think, how is that decent? You know, like, how can we agree that living in a country that does that is decent? Oh, you have to change the idea of decency. And so that's just A through D. But basically, I got up every morning and began where I'd left off the day before. And to come back to attention, the crucial thing for this was to unplug a bit, stop watching the news at night. I got off Facebook, which was just, you know, smashing my attention into smithereens. And I got up every morning and I read poems for an hour, which to me are the best way to focus attention. And that was the way I began sort of thinking my way through how language is a kind of lexicon of civic life and engagement, because it's a way for me to imagine. It's the only way, actually, for me to imagine what it's like to be you. It's how I read your book. It's how you told me what it was like to go and talk to Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. Yeah. And all the other wonderful people you talk to. Tell me something. You know, your book is set up as a series of interactions, almost as miniature relationships. And one of my favorite is a psychologist who has been working with a patient who's aphasic, and the psychologist is sick with cancer, and you go out and gradually over the course of this chapter, your relationship evolves very quickly. And are you writing kind of a closet story of attention as intimacy or attention as love in this book?
That became one of the most important definitions and or sort of facets of attention to me. And I'm so touched by what you just said about your parents, that they were the bestowers of such love and attention. Because in a sense, that's the purest way to understand attention. And it's when attention is so effortless and it's so, I mean, like, when you're falling in love with someone and you're sitting at dinner with them and you're asking them 1,000 questions, you would never pull your phone out. You would never feel that urge to sort of turn away.
Hold on a second. I'm just picturing my grandmother, my grandmother just sitting there kind of pulling out her phone.
Does your grandmother do that?
No, she died before the smartphone was invented. But one of the things one of my clearest memories of her is just not, you're the center of the world. Let me help you develop crippling narcissism, but just that real loving regard.
Right. Filled with sort of curiosity and kind of just pleasure also.
Yeah.
But I mean, we had a chance to say a little bit yesterday about your parents, and one of the entries in your dictionary that made me kind of laugh out loud and I so recognized it was your entry on questions, and how, you say like, remember questions. And then you talk about the power of asking questions, which now that we're in conversation, I see that you're a master question asker, because I had 1,000 other questions for you, but you
can see the wrestling umpire. He's like, reversal, 2 points.
But do you think that sort of the act of, I was always taught that asking questions was the definition of good manners. This was the kind of household I grew up in. And I'm sure I now drive people crazy by asking too many questions. But was that the ethos in your childhood too, John?
It was, but forgive me if I blur books here, because alongside of reading yours, I was reading a few other things. And one thing I did come across was, there's questions that are interesting or that are curious, that are kind of opening to a bigger space, conversational space. And then there are questions that have a presumed intimacy in them, or like a presumed direction, and there's, I'm sure you've sat, and I love everyone, including life coaches, but I'm sure you've been sat next to a life coach at a dinner or in some capacity, and they're beaming towards that wound, and they're like, they don't understand you if they don't find the wound that they can then open up. And I can see that coming from a mile away, because I grew up in a therapeutic environment with both parents being social workers, but their approach was actually very benign. And so every day at dinner, my family would have story time, as in I have 2 brothers, we would all tell our days. And so we would begin in order, and then we reshuffled because my little brother felt left out. And then we began a heckling process, because everyone's day would have the same format. And so I grew up in a world where asking questions was both the content and the content developing device for meaning, if you know what I mean. Like, interrupting was okay. And then I moved to the East Coast. I became closer to my East Coast family, who were a bit waspier. And so the kinds of questions I grew up being okay with in California were not okay.
So you sort of have to rein it in a little.
Yeah, questions that brought up sex, money, politics. There's sort of the big 4. I suddenly felt like I had come in there in chaps with like a cowboy hat, like, so how'd you all make your money here? And that kind of, that's how I felt coming in with my Western American understanding of what was okay to talk about. And I think one of the things that's beautiful about being a journalist, and I can see in your work, in your first book and this book, is what a brilliant thing it is to have the excuse to ask people not invasive questions, but just meaningful questions. Like, skip the small talk, go straight to like, so, why did you keep a notebook for every interaction you've had with a patient over 5 years? Like, how is this actually going to recreate the meaningful? I want you to talk a little bit about that interaction with that psychiatrist, because
it's fine, but then only if we can then hear about your new poetry collection.
Okay, deal.
But just to say briefly, I had the great luck of spending about over a year with a phenomenally kind man as he was fighting cancer, who had treated in psychoanalysis a patient who had had a stroke and lost the ability to talk. He had aphasia. And so each of their sessions was devoted to just painstakingly trying to decode the few syllables and mutterings that this man could still get out, that he could convey either by sort of garbled speech or in garbled writing. And this therapist just worked with him, I think it was over 6 or 7 years, with this unflagging, passionate attention. I mean, he loved this case. This case made his life. He said it was the most rewarding case he'd ever had. And it was, I could think of, when I was thinking about what do I include in a book about attention, which is a subject that can go in any direction, truly any direction. I came to him in my mind and I thought, I have to talk about, and he had appeared in my first book, but I thought I have to bring him back because his work was such an homage to attending in the most generous way to another human being and rescuing this man from his isolation.
Yeah. My mother was a hospice social worker, and she went back to work when I was 13, and was working for the Visiting Nurses Association of America. And these nurses often had social workers attached to their cases. So mid-1980s, California, a lot of early AIDS patients dying, in pockets of not very urban California, in Grass Valley and the foothills. And my mom would drive upwards of 150, 200 miles a day to go see people and sit there and listen to them talk about how they were feeling about dying, and would record what they said. And then every night after dinner, which she made because that was the time, we would sit down, I would do my homework and she would sit there and transcribe. And I realized she died of Parkinson's. So this was the last of her attention that mattered. This was the last stretch of her life where she could focus. She transcribed the patient notes. And I would sit there and do my thing. And I realized that there's something holy. I don't feel ashamed about saying it, but there's something holy in the way that you can attend to someone, even a stranger. And we're living in an infernal time for that to happen, as in right now is the hardest time ever, I think, to attend to strangers, because we're living in a world that, as you very well describe in your book, shatters and fragments attention, and that has recreated a sense of the world with a digital simulacra of it, in which all of our faculties for attending with complexity and nuance and forgiveness have been browned out in an algorithmic driven ones and zeros form of the panopticon. And so, I tweeted out a note about our event, but if I go on Twitter and leave it very quickly, because Twitter knows it thinks it knows what I want. And so going on to a medium that's going to show me only what it thinks I want, things that I've clicked on before, seems to me the opposite of living in the world like the one that you described in this book, with relationships and with meaningful interactions with people trying to help other people. A lot of the people that you talk to are basically, they're in the business of trying to help other people feel more comfortable about being in the world. And
I think that's true. Yeah.
And you write about the sort of the consequences of that replacement of the world with its replica.
Right. And actually, just to say something about Twitter for a second, I too am kind of allergic to Twitter. My drug of choice is more Instagram, but on Twitter, I feel so instantly depressed, not only by the self-confirming algorithm, but also by the constant leaping to assumption and classification about other people's moral value. Are they good or are they bad? Should they be eliminated? Should they be canceled? Or should they be reified and idolized? And there's no room for real attention. It seems like, to understand where someone is coming from. If they have a bad tweet and suddenly they find themselves disqualified, it's like so dehumanizing from my point of view that I too, John, can barely go on it. But wait, we can't leave this session without talking about your beautiful poems that are coming out in a matter of days.
Yeah. I was trying to think about, this is the book. It's like I basically live part of the year in Paris. You can feel bad. Poor me. But I teach there in a low residency writing program for NYU. And I was moving around a lot, sort of, I'll get to know the city, but then I found an apartment on a block that's very quiet, that's right near the Luxembourg Gardens. And I spent some time in the park, which I'd been in before, and I thought, why would I go anywhere else? And so for the last 5 years, I stayed at that apartment, and I spent a lot of time in the park. And I realized, as I spent time in the park, that everything, that we've just described about sort of making moral judgments, about the sort of agitation of our attention span, about the need for intimacy, about the feeling that we've lost something essential to being human, is all in the park, and it came over me in kind of waves, especially because the park is mostly a natural environment that's been curated, but animals are gradually, if you left it for a while, they would take over it very quickly.
Right.
And so living there, I just suddenly realized that this kind of balance we're all striving for, that's maybe sharpened by our technology, is always there, but it comes to a more physical level when you're in a natural environment. So I'll read you a poem that touches on maybe what our conversation has been slightly about, which is just the sense of sacrifice, what we've sacrificed to be in the speeded up world that we live in. This is called The Sacrifice. The difference between animals and us, the main one is they don't need to know it's a park. The coyote lopes through just the same, looking for food. We stop in mourning, sensing everything we've lost. We call that ceremony a park. I want to ask you about ritual, because thank you. A lot of the things that you describe in your book related to attention, if not the technology or certain ceremonies that you go to, or even taking a drug, they're ritualized.
Right.
And I wonder what your experience with attention and ritual has been, and if you've found any kind of benign ways to institute attention rituals in your life that don't make you feel like you're like a walking TED talk, or that you're sort of 2 steps away from Kabbalah.
Right. I know it's a funny thing about the neuroscience of attention, because the things that you sort of make a habit of, you lose conscious attention for. Your brain becomes more efficient by making them automatic. So I almost think this applies to addiction in a way, is that you're so in the habit of taking a pill, you lose the consciousness for what you're doing. It's like, if you ever found yourself on a tennis court, if you're really a good player, you're not. So there is something about habit and attention and conscious attention that the brain gets rid of it when it's something you're just truly used to doing. But this is not a how-to book, except to say that it helps to think about attention. It helps the ability to pay attention, to think about the value of attention. But my one little ritual is always writing as soon as I wake up, and just sitting down and doing it. And that's the only time I can write decently, is in the morning immediately. And then the afternoon is kind of wasteland for me. Do you find that?
Yeah, mornings are great. I just thought of something in your book, which I think every writer who is listening to this will appreciate, which is that when you're struggling to write your first book, and you're at the writer's room in New York, you sit down, and the first thing you put on the page is, I can throw this out.
Right, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I highly relate to that. That feeling where you start to avoid doing it because you think, oh, it's going to be terrible anyway.
Right.
And yeah,
Exactly.
I've found that if I can do things that open up my attention span and sort of make it feel roomy, and the acoustics are nice rather than tinny and like a underground techno club.
Right.
I want to write, and I think things that are worth writing down.
Mhm.
So I get up and either read poems or go to the window and drink coffee and then sit down, and sometimes it's like 10 minutes and sometimes it's an hour. But if I don't
And
do that, I don't write.
right. Is your approach to writing poetry different than it was for the dictionary?
No, actually, I find that if I write everything that way, it has a much better chance of surviving the Casey Schwartz, page header, because it just means that I'm thinking. I'm not trying to fill space. I'm thinking, and I don't know what I'm going to think until I actually create space in which to think it.
Mhm.
And this is one of the reasons why, as good as social media is for connecting us for important information and making it possible to speak and talk to each other when it might be illegal to do so, or if it's not safe to do so in public, I also think it's so damaging because it can make you so reactive. It's like,
Mhm.
here, be morally offended by this, and then you react to it. And
Right.
our time feels like it's very much defined by someone who has engorged himself in power by playing to that
Mhm.
need to react. It's like
Right.
this morning I sent a tweet out about Donald Trump because I woke up and I did my writing and I read the news and I thought, this is insane that someone is sitting there taking 3 hours of the world's attention, knowing virtually nothing about science in a period where we need to use science more than ever.
And I mean, and in the dictionary, you talk about how you must turn away from online in order to really agitate for change and for justice, and that those changes take place in our public forums and in our public spaces. But I mean, what this is like our quandary right now is that we're stuck at home online watching perhaps the most insane chapter of the Trump administration unfold.
Yeah.
What do we do? I mean, it's such a
Well,
paradox.
actually, to me, it's a paradox, but it's also a sort of apogee of the quandary, in the sense that the only thing we can really do to save ourselves right now, one of the only things, is to stay home, is to
Mhm.
not go out, is to be safe, is to be kind by thinking of others in advance,
Mhm.
and by, I think all of us, I would love to meet the person that didn't feel overwhelmed the last year. Like, I would love to meet that person and just ask them some questions. How'd you do it? But I feel, I think all of us felt a certain degree of being overwhelmed. And this pause, as awful as it is, as terrible as what's happening, and we can donate money online and things like that, or you can send PPE if you have it at home. But we can pull back too and try to think about, like,
Mhm.
what is our society's what would it look like if it was decent, if it was just, if we were taking a little bit better care of the environment so we weren't using it up like a resource.
Mhm.
And so I find that this time, there's a lot of potential in it
Mhm.
because we've put everything on pause.
Right.
I'm curious, what is it, you haven't mentioned this, but you have a 4-month-old baby, and you're kind of re-beginning life all over with a child as the world is kind of about to reboot. And has that made you
Right.
think about things that you would do or are doing differently because you're at home all the time and you have the ability to?
It's such a almost banal answer, but the whole time I was pregnant, I thought the one thing I really want to be adamant and purist about is avoiding screen time for him. But that, this is sort of a negative response because that's been totally impossible.
Yeah.
That's had to be completely suspended, and he's he regularly appears on long FaceTime calls with every member of his family. And so I am wondering, like, I do wonder how this is going to affect the kids who are just like on screens way more than they should be right now.
Yeah, I wonder, you were born after me, but we had a similar trajectory in that we began on paper, and then the
Right.
Apple showed up, and then
Right.
suddenly the internet came, and now I'm teaching students who grew up with the internet their entire lives.
Mhm.
And I found, I had some undergraduates last summer, all of them had developed technology distancing mechanisms. It was like a cycle, like they were all in technology AA. They were like,
So what was their most intriguing habits?
that they would delete their entire Instagram account like multiple times over. They'd be like, I'm done. And they'd like, throwing out Adderall pills. They're like, I'm done, I'm over. And then for like
and crawling their way back.
Yes, like for like 2 weeks they'd be in class and they'd just be like, yeah, I really like this book. And they're like their whole manner would change. And then something would trigger them back onto technology, as it always often does with us. And
then you sort of double down and you sort of binge on it to make up for lost time.
But I thought that was pretty amazing that, these are not students who were reading Jerome Lanier. They were recently out of high school, but they were coming to technology management on their own, or on their own terms.
Right.
Yeah. And so they're whatever intuition that develops over time, technology and growing up with it had not completely suffocated that intuition. And that made me super hopeful.
Other teachers I've spoken to say that they've seen that their students really, really struggle to even get through like a whole book. And I'm just curious, is that a cliche sort of, is that true? Or is that a cliche? Is that like hyperbole? Have you seen that?
I teach in the graduate program at NYU for creative writing. And so that's a pretty self-selected group. And my last class, the first book I assigned was Independent People by Halder Laxness, which is like a sneaky 250,000 words long. It's got little font, and then you're 80 pages in after a week of reading it, and the sheep are still having diarrhea, and you're like, what's happened? Why am I still reading this book? And yet it's mesmerizing. So they all read that. They finished that book. I was really happy about that because it's a brilliant novel, but it requires a scale of attention that is almost 19th century. And then with undergrads, I found that they actually did just fine. I think it's probably harder when people are in a busier environment. Like the undergrads I was teaching were in a study abroad program. But like back here in New York or in some other college town where they've got 4 other classes and maybe they have a job and rich and bountiful social lives and the internet talking to them all the time, maybe it's harder.
Right. Is it time to go to questions?
Yeah, we seem to be unmoderated, which is, no, they're there.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you guys so much. This conversation has been such a treat to listen to and feels really timely and important right now. So thank you. But we have lots of questions from the audience, so we'll try to get to a couple.
Okay.
All right. This question is from Rachel. This conversation has me thinking about how we show people we're paying attention by asking them questions. What's the hallmark of a good, meaningful question that demonstrates the practice of attending to other people?
Do you want to take that, Casey?
Sure. I know, and I'm curious what your answer is too, John, but I might say that there's a built-in benefit of the doubt question where you're not boxing someone in and you're not coming at them with assumptions. There's not an ideology driving it. So it's really coming from more of a pure place of curiosity, which, by the way, is so much more of a pleasurable place to come from, I think. You're not looking through one lens at someone assuming that they are X kind of a person. It's the spirit of discovery.
Yeah.
How about you, John?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't think anyone responds well to, aren't you a fraud, sir? It's like, oh, it's funny that you should ask, because I've always had this feeling of fraudulence, and you finally acknowledge. No, I think the right kind of intending question is one of, you're right, curiosity and belief that people are more complex than they might at first appear, and trying to find that complexity rather than the reduction. And so when I was joking about the sort of evil life coaches, again, there are lots of good life coaches, but they're also the ones that are like, let me find the one broken part of you, you broken robot, so that I can, and that's a kind of a very directed form of questioning. And I find in social settings, questions that sort of open up realms for passion are really fun. And it's hard to find the exact way to get there, but with everyone is interested beyond our knowledge of them in something that we can't imagine. So you probably have a passion that the beautiful white background behind you does not reveal. What is it? You know?
Right.
This question is coming from Emily. How is writers tasked with paying careful attention and sharing what you find with the world? How do you balance paying attention to cultural and political context and your immediate intimate context?
Meaning that are we obligated to bear witness to our time on screen? And if so, how can we turn away from screen in the name of attention? Is that the meaning that you got, John? Or what why don't you take this?
I think no one has to look at anything. Just as in writing, no one should be expected, just as a African-American writer doesn't have to write about Black characters or Blackness or race, just as any other person who grew up poor maybe or rich doesn't have to attend to their background. But I think a ethical engagement in the world means a weighing of scales of importance, as well as a kind of brief but meaningful acknowledgement of one's own optics. And so to me, Trump's press conferences are agitating, but they're only important to me because he's giving incorrect information that will lead to people being killed. It's not because Trump is a moron with funny hair who's an idiot. That's a distraction from the fact that he is killing people by giving them misinformation. And so I feel hard pressed not to acknowledge that in some way as a writer. But simultaneously, if I only did that, then I think I would blunt my attention on the ugly things of the world. And the world is not only ugly, if that makes sense. You know, right now, all these other things are happening. Like people are probably making love as we're talking, and they're making pizzas, and someone is eating a tomato like it's a piece of fruit, and a baby maybe in your own house is pooping. And all these things are proceeding uninhibited by Trump's press conferences to some degree. And so that's where I think scale comes into context about what to observe and how.
All right. We have time for two more here. How does the current pandemic change and/or affirm the ideas you were writing about in these books?
I have noticed just from interviewing people, talking to scientists, other writers, whoever, that right now people are having such a difficult time paying attention. And I've been thinking so much about why. And I don't know, John, have you, but we talked a little bit about this yesterday. Have you struggled with this?
Yeah, a little bit, but you know, one of the reasons I will ask you to tell this story briefly, because one of the things I found reboots attention is to slow down and like do an activity that involves slower time, like a puzzle or reading aloud. You have to ask someone. You can't just walk up to them and be like, you are now going to be starting to listen to my beautiful voice, reading the entirety of my own book to you. Yeah, that But there are other things that you can read. And so the other night I just read to my partner the Dennis Johnson story, Emergency, which is about these two orderlies. They're both fuck ups who are in a ER wing of a hospital, who are kind of doing drugs as it feels like the world is falling apart around them. And it was so brilliant to read, because to appreciate the humor, I had to slow down enough to let his jokes not run on top of each other. But as good writing, it sort of quickened and brought attention to a point. But you had, in your book, you have this hilarious story about being asked to read an essay about attention to someone who's not paying attention to you.
And, oh, God forbid he's on this right now. But I think you're referring to a boyfriend that I had in my early 30s. And this was actually how I got into David Foster Wallace's obsession with attention, was that just at the moment I realized, oh, this relationship is really not going to work out. I mean, literally at the moment that I realized it, he emerged from the bathroom and said, oh, have you ever read this then? And he handed me this, the commencement speech that David Foster Wallace had given at Kenyon in 2005, where he talks about the critical role of attention in sort of literally saving your life. And I read it, and he said, read it aloud then. And I read this whole thing to him, and it was like, when you're in a state of shock or sadness, it's so hard to absorb what you're actually doing. And it was like this, I read it sort of mindlessly. I was only conscious of, oh, I hope I sound reasonable reading it, And then it was literally years later, as I was writing this book and wondering who to include, that I suddenly flashed back on that moment, and I thought, David Foster Wallace. And that was what, that paved the way for him becoming a huge character in this book. So I don't know if that really relates to the pandemic, but because you asked me to speak to it, John,
well, I do think that the pandemic must be drawing to a sharp point what it means to live with someone, and what it means to share the air with them, and what it means to respect their silence, what it means to try to entertain them, and how to share that entertainment.
Conversationalist, right?
What's that?
To keep up your end of the conversation.
Well, I'm sure, like you get into a long relationship, and suddenly all the things that you normally did, you're like listening and then coming up with witticisms, and instead you're just sitting there eating Fruit Loops, being like, "What are we gonna watch tonight?" And
totally.
And to me, that like your book is a history to some degree of relationships in a very micro form. It's like a very thin backbone of the book. But I love that, because as you go along, the forms of attention are deeper and more meaningful.
Right.
And it also just gets harder, like the longer you're in a relationship, to remember that, this is water. This space that you share with someone.
Right. Or to see them fresh and see them new.
Yeah. What's your next book going to be about?
Oh, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? I'm craving something like about California, and I don't know why.
You write very well about California. My brothers both live in LA, and so while I was reading your book, I had these powerful longings for California. You have a description of driving sort of in sparkling light or something, and I just remember one of the nice things about California is it feels like it's paying attention to you with its light.
Especially at 5:00.
At 5:00, there's this kind of golden thing that happens.
And all is forgiven at 5:00 in California.
Yes, whether it's beer o'clock or not.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, California, you reminded me, your book reminded me of this wonderful history of the development of the computer that was told through the development of psychedelics.
Oh, what the Dormouse said.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that book.
I love that mind expansion and technology as mind expansion developed in the same place.
Right.
And it seems like maybe there are, California's doing brilliant things right now with the pandemic in terms of trying to manage it, and they were the first to shut down they're sharing their PPE and other supplies with the rest of the country. And it's really a model, and like a model of generosity. You know,
Right.
whereas the president's modeling stinginess and mendacity, Gavin Newsom, whatever he is as a private citizen, as a public persona, is saying like, we will send this to you, and we're not going to make you sign a contract. Just send it back when you're done, in case we need it.
Right.
Maybe the solution to a lot of things that your book is kicking up about how to be is a book about California.
Well, okay, great. I'm so happy that that resonates for you. What about you, John? Or do you have a sense of your next project?
Actually, one of the reasons I'm reading stories aloud is that the next book that I have after The Park is a book of the best American stories from the last 50 years. Because I don't know, I just I find reading so amazingly pleasurable, but especially when you're reading one of those just knockdown killer stories that makes the whole world stop, like Ursula Le Guin's The People Who Walk Away from the Amelas, or Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri, or I don't know, Ted Chiang's stories, or Ken Liu. There's just a really good story is gravity defying and breathtaking and mind expanding. So I've spent the last year reading about 1,000 stories, couple a day, and so that this is coming out maybe in spring.
Okay.
But I just feel like curating right now in this blizzard environment where there's like, you can read every story ever written by everyone who's ever gone to school, plus all Raymond Carver's old drafts. It's cool, but it's not helpful for those of us, which is everyone, with limited time.
Great. Well, as much as I hate to cut this conversation off, I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you both, John and Casey. This has been such a treat. So
thank you, Abby.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. If you would like to get your hands on both of these books, which you should, you can do so at the link below. And it sounds like you can pre-order The Park as well. So please purchase them from the Loft bookshop, support indies, support the Loft, and support these amazing authors with us today. Also at the support button, if you'd like to throw in a couple bucks to support the Loft program, we would be deeply grateful. I'd also like to thank Wordplay's presenting sponsors, Star Tribune and St. Catherine University, for making all of this happen. And don't forget to check out what next week's Wordplay lineup has in store for you. We will be announcing that this afternoon at loftwordplay.org. Thanks again, John and Casey, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.